movie. I'm just gonna read a little bit about Lalo. Jose Eduardo Aguilar Lalo is a deported filmmaker, a storyteller, and a spoken word artist born in Ciudad Juarez and raised in Heber City, Utah. He studied methodology in foreign language teaching at Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez and graduated in screenwriting from Facultad de Cine in Mexico City. He has been a keen promoter for deportee creativity and storytelling now on the south side of the border as he writes and shoots the post-deportation experience between Ciudad Juárez and Central Mexico. Lalo, bienvenido, welcome, gracias. Thank you for sharing your story. And now the floor is for you. Please feel free to share whatever you want. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Adriana. I'm gonna get really close to my camera because I'm having some mic issues. So hopefully y'all can hear me. Can you hear me all right? Okay. Well, I don't know. I don't know where to start. I would love to hear your thoughts about the movie in a little bit after I figure out how to start this conversation. Yeah, well, I'm glad y'all joined today so we can to be able to watch this last story out of the 3 stories from Home Somewhere Else. I could start off by telling you that I did not want to be in this film at the beginning. I was hesitant to be in this film. No, it's always kind of there's this vulnerability, like you feel vulnerable whenever your story is gonna be told. But what really got me was the animation. I really wanted to see my brother and I animated. And usually the work that I've been doing here in Mexico, like whether it's film or photography or spoken word, is post deportation. So I don't really talk about my growing up, my upbringing back home, back in Utah. So that's another thing that got me. I thought it would be sweet to watch my childhood animated, and I think the directors and especially the animators did a pretty good job. I think before I continue, I would really like to take on like 2 or 3 questions. If anybody has 2 or 3 questions about the film specifically, or something they saw in the film, or just your thoughts about the film, and then we can go from there.
This is Annie. I had one question that came up. This is my 3rd or 4th time seeing this section of the film. What is about why 5 months? Why do you stay in detention for 5 months? Why didn't they just have you go back to Mexico or go to Mexico right away? I'm curious because it's almost like a punishment to be in jail for 5 months.
That's a really good question. I don't know how many of you are familiar with detention centers. They're just private prisons, you know, and that's how detention centers work. You could be in there for months, you could be in there for years. They're just like moving you around from state to state because it's money. The more people are locked up inside these detention centers, the more money the private company receives, no, from the government. So most of the detention centers, the thousands or millions that are locked up in detention centers, they already did their time, or they already paid their price for their criminal, whatever their criminal charge was, or yeah. So they're just in detention center because it's money. That's how it works. Or some people were fighting their case. I was fighting my case. That's why it took longer. But there are some people in detention center that were never fighting my case. That was my dad's case, to be redundant. That was what happened to my dad. My dad was arrested for for previous charges that he had committed when he was before 9/11. Then after 9/11, years later, they just showed up at his house. They're like, "Oh, you did this many years ago," and threw him in detention. And he was in detention center for 2 years, just bouncing around. Like sometimes we wouldn't know about him for months, and then he would call us like he would be like, "Oh, I'm in Oklahoma," and then he'll call us months later, and now I'm in Pennsylvania or something like that. And then they just kept moving him around until they finally just drop him off at the border, and that's why it takes so long. But yeah, that's why people are in there for long periods of time, because it's money for the private prisons, and that's how that works. That was a really good question.
Anyone else have questions?
Okay, I can talk a little bit about the detention center. My experience in the detention center was I mentioned it a little bit in the movie, but I didn't go far into it. In detention center, out of like the 200, 300 people that were there, about most of them, 95% were Mexican, but there were like a couple hundred Mexicans, but there were only two of us who grew up in the States. So we, like Utah, there's a lot of Mexicans or Hispanic community now, but growing up in the 90s, there were no Mexicans. I was the only Mexican in elementary. By middle school, there were like three of us. 1 second. Sorry. And so, yeah, there were not a lot of Mexicans. So I just grew up with Anglo people, my white friends who I just grew up with. So by the time I was locked up in detention center, only me and this other kid were the ones who spoke English. Out of all the Mexicans, we preferred to speak English, or we spoke Spanglish. And it was one day English, one day Spanish, and we would prefer to watch TV in English. So there was always this I don't know if it's discrimination by the Mexican community in detention center, because we spoke English. Almost everyone there who was Mexican, they're Mexican, but they moved to the States as adults, or they only lived a few years in the States. So that was a very difficult moment, because growing up, I always had this identity issues, no? Like, yeah, I'm Mexican, but there's no Mexicans here. Most of my friends are white. So I just grew up in that environment. Just hiking, I was a Boy Scout for like a couple years. And I grew up just hiking, fishing. And I love where I grew up. I'm glad my parents took me to Utah. After getting deported and being here in Mexico, and being around deportees and returnees here in Mexico, I've gotten to even love Utah even more, because I just love the way I grew up. I think if I would have grown up like in LA, where there were more Mexicans, or there was like maybe some gang activity, my life would have been different, or if I would have grown up in New York, maybe more diversity, or Chicago or Florida, or wherever. But I'm really glad my parents took me to Utah. My grandma was the first one to move to Utah, actually, in the 80s. And then we followed. I want to talk a little bit if no one has a question right now, I'm gonna just keep talking. Yeah, I would like to mention that this deportation experience, it's tough. You go through family separation, you go through mental health issues, identity issues, systematic I don't know, just these bureaucratic obstacles that happen. No, whatever comes with the whole being locked up, criminalized, and then sent back to a country which you're where you were born, but you don't know. But it took me years to get to this, to have all these reflections. But after years of being alone and here in Mexico, reflecting on getting to know myself, what I want, and reflecting on my experiences and the undocumented experience in the States and the deportation experience, I think, and because my mom has a house in Juarez, so I was able to just live there rent free and just be by myself. It gave me this sense of freedom in a way. I don't know. I don't know if freedom is the right vocabulary, but it's a sort of liberation. You don't have the weight of being undocumented anymore. Yeah, you want to go back home, but you don't have this weight, and you have some free time for yourself. And at least that's what I did. I took this time to get to know myself, about the person who I was, who I am, who I want to be, and I started writing. And I found through writing, I wrote a book which I haven't published. I finished writing it in 2016, and it's just sitting there. I'm on like my third draft, and that was just like letting everything go, everything, all these emotions, just getting it out there. And it was like a process, like a cathartic process, not just to move on to the next stage of deportation, which the next stage for me was a creative stage. Because I always say, like, this post-deportation experience, it seems to never end. It's like it's processes. You go from one process to another, to another, to another, and it just never seems to end. Like right now, I'm still going. It's been 10 years, 11 years after my deportation, and I feel identified with a deportee. I don't feel like a migrant. I don't feel like all these labels that the U.S. and Mexico government puts on me. But I still feel like I'm going through these deportation processes, post-deportation processes, which right now, like I mentioned, is creative. And that's where I decided to take my experience. No, after all these years of reflecting on myself, about where I am, where I was, where I want to go. I really took that time to really that free time, that time that I had for myself, not having to hustle. Like in the States, being undocumented, you just gotta hustle even harder because you're making minimum wage, or you have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. So you always working, always working, always working. And it wasn't until after deportation that my body maybe was just exhausted. Like this, I was drinking a lot. I went through this when I got arrested. I wasn't my stage where I was drinking a lot. It was after high school, and this arrest that you see in this film, I was 23. I was going to college already, but I had an alcohol issue when I was 18 and 19, right after high school, when being undocumented really started hitting me. Everything started coming down on me, and I was drinking. And just the way of being undocumented was just too heavy, maybe, that I was young and didn't know how to handle it. And it wasn't until I got deported that I felt this weight off my shoulders in a way. And it allowed me to write and to decide that I want to tell stories, that I want to be a storyteller. And it made me go back into film school. I was going to film school. I was only in my first semester when I got arrested and deported. That was in my first semester of film school at Salt Lake Community College. And it took me 4 or 5 years to really get back into it, like to come out of my funk and come out of my shell and really decide, okay, like I need to do something else. But it took me like 4 or 5 years of depression, things like that. So, sorry, there's a lot of this. But I wanted to mention, after these 4 or 5 years of really being depressed, abusing drugs and alcohol, wanting to go back home, I really started finding community here in Mexico. I started looking for people who also grew up in the States, are now here in Mexico. And I was trying to find community, or if I couldn't find it, I was going to create it. I knew there were thousands of us here in Mexico who grew up in the States, are now deported. And I started being in spaces where I found other people, and started finding more stories, and that pushed me to create a documentary, which is the documentary that I just finished this year. That's how I met Carlos and Jorge. It was at a film festival where I was at a workshop with my documentary, and that's how I met the directors of this film. And I finally finished my film this year after like 5 years of trying to get it done, because it took me a while, because not only was I trying to be a filmmaker, but I was also going through these deportation processes. No, it's not like someone from the outside that is coming in and getting the story. I was going through both. I was trying to learn how to make film, and I was going through family separation, mental health, and all these things that come with deportation. I'm trying to share. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. I can't share it.
Ahorita te hacemos co-host. One second, and Lalo is gonna be able to share.
I made him co-host.
So this is something that I had here, that I used the other day in this other space where I was presenting some of my work. That's my mugshot from the detention center. I have a black eye because the cops, as you saw in the film, the cops, they handcuffed me, and after they handcuffed me, they threw me on the ground, and they cracked my head open, and they busted my eye. So that's why I have a black eye there, which I had it for like a month. And so that's my mugshot. And this is something that I presented the other day, because I'm trying to position myself as a storyteller, but not just a storyteller, but as a deported storyteller. That's because that's where I'm creating from. From my deportation experiences, where I create. From growing up undocumented, from this immobility. I talk a lot about immobility because as I grew up undocumented in the US, I never had that mobility. I could never come to Mexico and visit Mexico, because if I would have came to Mexico, I wouldn't be able to go back home. And now, as a deportee, I can't go back home. So that's where I create, from this lack of mobility between both of my places that I call home. That's where I'm creating from. This is a screenshot, or this is a still from a home movie. This comes up in my documentary. My documentary is called El Digno Retorno, or Dignified Return. My documentary talks about deportees and returnees here in Mexico who grew up in the States, are now deported. There's a lot of people in the streets who are deported because they grew up in the States and they don't have family in Mexico, or they don't know Mexico. But the Mexican government, this last elections, when I was shooting this film, it said the Mexican government, the rhetoric they were saying, or their narrative, they were saying that if you grew up in the States and you speak English and get deported, you're gonna have a job and you're gonna have a dignified return to Mexico. But they don't look at all these characteristics about this profile of people. No, like it's not just about speaking English. There's all this mental health issues that we go through once we get deported, and they're trying to integrate us into the labor sector when it's more than that. It's not just about work. No, we're going through all these processes as well. And I think I had been in the States I had been in the States for like 2 years. I think this was like 99 or 98. My mom used to work at McDonald's. You can see the McDonald's cup back there. She used to bring us some food. And she used to always have a camera. So I was always shooting. So yeah, we lived in a 1-bedroom apartment off the side of the highway back in Heber. I don't know if anyone here has been to Utah or to Heber specifically, but it used to be a small town. Now it's a little city. And this is my homie AJ. He also grew up in Utah. He grew up in the city. He's in my film as well. And he's drinking some pulque. Pulque is like this beverage that comes from the maguey, which is like a plant, you would say. And I chose this specifically because when we get deported, like, yeah, it's a horrible thing to go through. And when you get to Mexico, you get to experience like this Mexican things that you were missing out on. No, and one of these Mexican things that we're missing out on was this pulque, this drink, this beverage that has been drunk by people in this territory for ages. And here AJ says, hey, let me get a sip of that pulque. Let me get in the mood. So also this is another, this is Rosie. She's also in my film, and that's her grandma. The reason why I put this here is because not a lot of people talk about returning to an indigenous community. Rosie here is from an indigenous community in Oaxaca. And she returned. She grew up in Wisconsin. And she returned, and now she just, her post-return experience has just been her and her grandma, because all of her family is still back in Wisconsin. And so she is there with her grandma. And here is just this picture that I took of this map, no? Like, we're all coming from different parts of the States, and now we're based in Mexico City, a lot of us. And here is someone that, like a quote that someone said, the response from the government in those years was, there aren't any numbers. Now they're confronted with realities they never knew existed. So yeah, the Mexican government thought we didn't exist because they didn't have any numbers about this specific profile of people, us who grew up in the States and are now back in Mexico. There's my alien number. In my work that I do, I use my alien number a lot. Because that's where I'm creating from. No, like, if you're an immigrant in the US, you have an alien number because you went through a process of getting either an immigrant visa or gaining some sort of legal status. Then you get an alien number. But if you were always undocumented, then you get your alien number when you get deported. Right? And that's how I gained my alien number when I was in detention center. It's like my name didn't exist anymore. I was just this alien number. And now I use it here to create. Like these pictures, these pictures that have my alien number. I have my alien number tattooed on my wrist. This middle picture right here, you can't see it, but the alien number is like right here on the top left. And it's a letter that I received from USCIS, which is my inadmissibility back into the US because of mental health issues. And my alien number right here, I painted on this. So those are some self-portraits. You know, you can read this. I can read this if you want. It's just a description about the pictures. It says, birth from the photographer's incarceration and removal process. The alien number 8205076807 manifests itself in various forms after deportation. Unable to break away from the criminalization which continues to cross his life, Jose Eduardo converts the act of photography into a ludic product of his experience. one where he is allowed to explore, reshape, and create, one where he is not tied solely to his migration experience. So, and I have my alien number under my credits for my film. So that's a little bit of where I'm creating from this experience. I have been able to I don't know, like when I talk about like all this stuff that I'm doing right now with spoken word, with my film, which I'm presenting my film in different spaces right now. Sometimes people look at me and tell me like, oh, you're reintegrated into Mexico, or you have found success here in Mexico. When in reality, I don't see it like that. I don't feel like it's some sort of success or anything like that. I'm just trying to tell the stories of my community now here in Mexico. And that's a little bit about, oh, I have some pictures to show you, some more pictures before I stop talking. Sometimes like this post-deportation experience can be so diverse, no? It also has a lot to do, like I mentioned before, what state did you grow up in? Like some states are more lenient towards the undocumented community than other states. Like I could always drive back home, even though I was undocumented. I could always have a license, and it wasn't until I arrived to Mexico when I met other deportees that they were like, "Whoa, you could drive?" I was like, "Yeah, couldn't you?" And they're like, "No, not in Georgia or not in North Carolina or whatever where they grew up." No? So depends in which state you grew up in. That's gonna impact your undocumented experience and your return or deportation experience. Another thing that could really impact your deportation experience is love, or maybe you never found love in the States, or maybe you never felt love, or whatever love is to you, no? Maybe you never found it back home, even though you lived in the States all of your life, and then you get deported, and then you find that love, or that whether it's self-love or love towards another person, then you find it here in Mexico, and you don't want to go back home because you have found it here. So a lot of things come into play, no? Let's see. I'm reading the question. Do you know what is the average time a person stays in a detention center in the States? You mentioned it can be months or years, but I was wondering about an average. No, there's not an average. Sometimes it's days. I've met people here who were there for a couple of years. The most I've seen, or yeah, I've known about is 2 years. Only in detention, nothing with their criminal charges or anything. Only 2 years. Only detention, I mean. Sometimes it's days, weeks, months, but the most I've seen is a couple years. Okay. And one more. I'm going to show one more picture and then we can continue.
There's also another question in the chat, looks like.
Okay. I'm going to go to that question here. Here is another picture about, this is how the undocumented or the returned or deported people we are organizing now here in Mexico. We're organizing and demanding or just advocating for mobility. No, a lot of us don't want to go back and live in the States, but we want to visit our families. But we continue to be criminalized when we try to go get a visa because they think we're going to overstay. But a lot of us, we already have like a professional stability here in Mexico. Like we just want to go back home and just go home and see like our friends or just visit our families, and then come back and keep living our lives here in Mexico. So we are organizing. There's a lot of deportees and returnees who are organizing here in Mexico. Another picture. There's a lot of us here. This one we're organizing as well. There's a bunch of people here. But yeah, there's a strong community now here in Mexico who are organizing. Let me go to that to that question. Okay, how old were you when you came into the US? Do you have any memories of that experience? How old? How old was I when I went to the States? I was 8. And before 9/11, it was easier. We had a visa. We had it was a border crossing card. Like I mentioned, my grandma was the first one to move to the States, like in the 80s, and we used to go visit her when we still lived in Juarez. You know, we just cross. We had this border crossing card. We used to just visit her, and that's how we crossed. Then my parents just decided to overstay their visas. And then after 9/11, they expired and we just never came out of the States. Or well, I think it expired like that year or the year or in 2000. But after 9/11, everything changed, no? Regarding immigration, national security and all that stuff. So yeah, I was 8 and I went into the States legally, you know, with a border crossing card.
Lalo, I have another
And-
another question for you. Maybe if you can talk also, because two things about the experience of being a child, not deciding where to stay or where to go, but then feeling the United States as your home and thinking that you are going back to, they always tell you that Mexico is your home, but it's not, it's also not your home. And how is the welcoming, if there is a welcoming process or in Mexico, or if you feel exactly the same as maybe not criminalized, but stigmatized in Mexico, about the process in between two countries and your feelings about it.
Yeah, well, Mexico is not a very welcoming country. And especially because for many years, the people who spoke English were the ones who had access to these English schools or whatever, no? Or people who came from like a different background, like money, or people who had access to English schools, usually lighter skinned people, lighter skinned Mexicans with some sort of privileges. They, for the longest time, they were the only ones who would speak English. But now in this last decade, people with brown skin, short brown Mexican kids are coming back speaking English and disrupting that whatever, you know, disrupting the way that people speak English, or who's supposed to speak English in Mexico, or what someone who speaks English looks like. And I think that hasn't, I don't know, the country itself, they haven't really, I don't know, how can I put it? There's stages and there's spaces, no? Different stages, there's different spaces. For example, I just came from doing an interview for this. I interviewed a family like a couple hours ago. I interviewed a family who they came back from Texas. The 3 kids are US born. And I think one of the parents got deported, so they all came back. And the three kids are US born. The kids are undocumented here in Mexico. They haven't been able to go to school for 2 years. And actually the youngest kid, he was finally able to start school this year, a couple of weeks ago. And the teachers are the ones who bully him the most. Apart from some students, it's the teachers who bully him the most because he speaks English and because he has broken Spanish. No, and he's US born. Like some people, they understand, oh, he was born in the States, that's why his Spanish is kind of broken. But there are also people who were born in Mexico, but who grew up in the States and now come back to Mexico and they have broken Spanish as well. But that's not acceptable because they were born here, no? So the Mexican society is like, why do you have broken Spanish if you were born in Mexico? You know, like, why are you acting like you want to be an American or something like that? So that's one of the things that happens everywhere. just recently, like or a couple of months ago, one of my colleagues, she was on the phone speaking English on the phone on the street, and somebody tried to choke her and told her like, "You're in Mexico, speak Spanish." And they went and tried to like attempted to choke her. So like, yeah, Mexico's not a very accepting yeah place. Even the own families, this family that I just interviewed, they were telling us how most of the people who their family after coming back from the US, their families are the ones who decided to not talk to them because they speak mostly English. They don't like the kids speaking English. The grandpa, it's like, and it's not like they're trying to speak English to the grandpa or the cousins because obviously they don't speak English. Just speaking English between them, amongst them, the families don't accept it. So sometimes it's a family, sometimes it's the government itself that doesn't understand this dynamics because we have been in the States for decades. You know, our families have been in the States for decades, have gone through so much that people here, they don't understand it. I'm going through the questions right now. Okay, so we don't hear anything of the afternoons. Yeah. Monica's comment that she put. She says the stories you are telling are important stories for Americans to hear. Yes, we hear about crossers, we hear about deportees. Yeah, and you have to realize, or you have to acknowledge that most of the stories in this film, the three stories, they are from people who migrated to the States like in the early 2000s or in the 90s. It's not the same for the people who are crossing right now. For the stuff that you see in the media right now, it's a different context. You know, it's totally different. And their countries are even worse right now than they were years back. You know, like years back, it was Mexicans crossing mostly. Right now, it's a lot of Central Americans, South Americans, Asians, Africans. But yeah, it's different. The border is different. After 9/11, the border is different. So yeah, it's not the same trying to cross. If you've never been to the States, trying to cross right now and then get deported, as if you had already lived there for 20 something years, 20, 30 something years. How can the kids of undocumented, could the kids be undocumented if any of the parents is Mexican? They are adult witnesses. They just have to register. That is a really good, that is a, yeah. So Irene says, how can they be undocumented here in Mexico? Well, they can. And that's usually most of the time the case, especially in the states that are further south than the northern border. An example is this family that I just interviewed. So something that's happening right now in Mexico is that, yeah, under the law, under Mexican law, if you are born to Mexican parents, if you're born in the States or wherever in the world, if you're born to Mexican parents, or at least one of your parents is Mexican, you're automatically Mexican. That's under law. But there's all this process that you have to do to get the double nationality. And something that happens, that is happening right now in Mexico, there are thousands of US born kids undocumented here in Mexico, because to be able to get the double nationality, the dual nationality, dual citizenship, the parents have to get the apostille. They have to get the stamp, which is the apostille, to say that that birth certificate is authentic. But it's just I think what do you call it? A notary. A notary does it. They just stamp it to say that that birth certificate is real, no? But the Mexican government doesn't even check if that stamp is real. So like, there's no point of having that apostille. And the people, the US kids, they can't get their dual citizenship because they ask the parents that they need that apostille, that stamp. But the only place they can get that apostille is in the States. But if you were deported, or if you were undocumented and now are in Mexico, you can go to the States and get the apostille. So the kids are undocumented here because the parents, they can't go back and get it. So that's why they are undocumented here, because yeah, it's like you're saying it, and they're automatically Mexican, but that's just on paper. Like everything else here in Mexico, no, it just stays on paper, but it doesn't get passed down to state or local level, or it's not being implemented the way it should. But it's just on paper. You can't speak Spanish in the U.S. You can't speak English in Mexico. Totally. Yeah. As an immigrant from Mexico, as a dancer, I have explored topics of identity and leadership. Could you talk about how your experience as a deportee who has gone through deep struggles has fueled your work as an artist and how it continues to inspire your work? Yeah. Why did I resort to art making and how that has empowered my journey? Well, like I mentioned, that's where I create from. No, I think these there are so many how can I say it? For the longest time, there's been this whole like double or identity, two identities, no? Like there's always this thing ever since the Selena movie, no? You're too Mexican for the US or too American for Mexico. But I think that comes from how can I say it? Like a lot of this Chicano or dual thing comes from having mobility, you know, like from having mobility between both countries. And that's where a lot of the stories have been told, from mobility, from being Mexican or American or being both. But there's not a lot of stories being told from the lack of mobility and how that lack of mobility impacts your identity, the way you identify, you know, or so that's where I create from this immobility and wanting to tell the complexities and the diversities that exist within this culture or subculture that it is us who grew up in the States having this lack of mobility. Okay, so got it. So they were never registered as Mexicans by the parents in the US, so now they cannot do it because they are separated. It's amazing all the nuances. Yeah, exactly. It's a lot easier if you get your dual citizenship for your kids in the States. Yeah, you just go to the consulate and do it, no? But if you never did it and then you get deported and all your family comes to Mexico, trying to do it from Mexico is a pain in the ass. So that's what is happening. And
Lalo, there is another, so sorry, but there is another question before those that you maybe didn't see. It's if you, from Annie, or really, have you been able to see or be with your mother since deportation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, yeah, my mom just after what, 25, more than 25 years of being undocumented, my mom finally became she has her papers now. So it was 25 years, you know, and my brother just got his papers too. He married an American, which was also a pain in the ass. It took 3 years. My brother has been dating his wife for like 12 years. And they have been married for 3. And when they started the process, I've heard it only takes 6 months, but for my brother, it was 3 years because they kept asking. Literally, they would show up at the house, like USCIS would show up at the house like unannounced and just go in the house and be like, where do you sleep? Where do you sleep? What side of the bed does your husband sleep on? Like all these questions are like, no, we need more evidence. Bring us more evidence. Like from pictures when they started dating, like when they were in their teens. And it was never enough. So like 6 months later, another appointment for more evidence. 3 months later, 6 months later, more evidence. And that was like a 3-year process. And finally, last July, my brother got his green card. But it was, and that also, how can I explain it? Like also my parents, my brother and my mom having mobility, that also impacts my post-deportation processes, no? Like maybe I don't have this need like to go back home as much as I did before they had papers, because now they come to Mexico and now I can see them. Which also, you know, like them gaining that mobility also, I don't know, it did something positive to like my mental health. You know, I don't worry as much as I used to for their health or their well-being, which of course I always do, no, but it's different now. And so yeah, that was a pain in the ass with my brother, that I just couldn't believe like the things that immigration would ask them. Like I would talk to my sister-in-law, and obviously my sister-in-law, she's a white American. She was so distant to all these things before this process with my brother. No, she just couldn't believe it. She just couldn't believe it, and she would talk to me about trying to talk to her family about it. Her family's from Oregon. They're really Republican, right wing, pro-gun, pro-Trump. Which pro-gun is like whatever. No, I like guns. I'm pro-gun. Like, but like her explaining to me how the process of her trying to explain these things that she was going through with my brother to her family, like, because her family is one of those people that, oh, get in line. Why don't you just get in line? You know, like as she was trying to explain all these things that she's going through with my brother, like that USCIS would literally show up at the house like at night or in the interviews to really ask them like about favorite food, what food doesn't he eat, or both. No, they would ask both, like what side of the bed do they sleep on, and just questions that just seem unnecessary sometimes. So yeah, that's the process of, or the story about my brother gaining his green card.
Lalo, if I can ask you another question just quickly, because that's something that we get as immigrants here, and that's a problem for everyone, but especially for people who comes in certain conditions and precarized people, communities. But people always tell you, why is people coming that way if they can just come legally, no, to say so. And what you mentioned, it's important. Where your parents able, or are immigrants able to have a line or legal, let's say, way to come, because that's important for a lot of Americans to understand that there are no ways to come for a lot of people in supposedly legal ways.
Yeah, this is such a complex topic, you know, because most of the people, something that I think a lot of Americans need to understand, that the people who are at the border right now, or who are asking for asylum, they're not going in illegally. Like, it's legal to ask for asylum. You know, like, yeah, there's a huge issue going on at the borders right now, but a lot of it has to do because the US destabilized those countries and the violence, the things that are happening in those countries, you know, like they're going through Mexico. For those people that are coming from Central and South America, is hell. Going through Mexico is hell. The stuff that I've heard, because I do a lot of work in shelters with migrants, and the stories that I hear, they're horrible. Like, and I ask myself, why do they go through all this? But also, like, they'd rather go through all this and try to gain asylum in the States than stay in their countries. Why? Because all the BS that's happening in their countries, you know, that, which is, I don't know which one is more horrible, because the stuff that happens to them in Mexico is like the kidnappings, the human trafficking and things like that. Like, yeah, I don't know. It's a complex issue. But they're escaping. They're literally escaping what is happening to them in their countries. No, when I was in a shelter, I had this lady. The, she was telling me how she was raped in front of her kids, and then her kids then they chopped off the head of her two sons in front of her. Like that's the type of stuff that's happening in those countries. No, yeah, horrible stuff that is happening in those countries. So it's like, okay, like they'll rather go through all this journey of crossing through Mexico and getting to the US-Mexico border and going through all this stuff that happens to them. They'd rather go through that than stay in their countries. And like, I don't know. We have never, at least I have never been through that situation. So I can't be anybody to say like, oh, you're do it the right way. If there is the right way, like, I don't know. Something I have seen also in Mexico that in those last few years, since the caravan started in 2018, that the xenophobic, a lot of xenophobic, like agendas or people's thoughts or ideologies like that, it has skyrocketed. The racism here has skyrocketed. You hear the same stuff now here in Mexico, like go back to your country, things like that. And I don't know, I really don't. It's overwhelming just to think about it. Yeah.
Lalo, that's so much, and it's so amazing all that you shared. I know that everybody here has really learned a lot. Adriana, did you want to say something about folks turning on their cameras if they wanted to?
Yes, if you wanna, maybe we all be together, Annie, and turn on your cameras. And if you want to say something to Lalo in the chat box, but I just wanted to thank Lalo again. Lalo, this is very important. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing this experience of returnees and deportees, because that's also important. And also to know that people who has been deported don't have like a place to just go and continue with their lives like nothing, like just go back. So it's important for people to know that we all countries are doing this to communities, to kids who were brought, bring here, no? And but with reason of the parents, it's not that they just decided to go and because they want a better life for them, but going back and not having that opportunity, it's very bad. And it's a misconception that thinking that just because you're going back to Mexico and because your parents are Mexican, you're gonna be no, to have an easy path. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much to everyone for being here and hearing these stories, because for us, it's important for you to know what is really happening. So I don't know, Lalo, if you want to close with something, and if people want to share something or turn on your camera if you want, or say something so we can finish.
I don't know. I'm open for some questions, or if somebody wants to say anything.
Anybody? Okay.
Well, I do
Okay.
thank you so much. So this has opened my eyes to so many things that I had no idea. And I really admire your healing process and how you've turned it into art that you are sharing with other people so that our eyes can be opened. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think something that just came to my mind. A lot of the stuff that I've been doing regarding spoken word poetry, like it has been a lot like just letting everything out, think like post deportation, growing up undocumented, things like that. Sometimes I say the stuff that I write, like poetry wise, is not very pretty. It's just a lot of things that have to do with systematic issues of deportation, detention centers, call centers, which is where a lot of call centers is where you find deportees here in Mexico. But I'm in the process also of evolving into a different type of writer. You know, like I've had this stuff just bottled up or just in my notebook for years, and I see myself crossing into another stage of right now of my writing. I'm trying to write like prettier things, and I'm in that process, no, like evolving as a writer and getting more into filmmaking, which is this documentary that I did. It kind of pushed me to write fiction. I felt in a way invasive with people's stories, even though everyone in my documentary is someone close to me or people around me. But in a way, I felt invasive, and it pushed me to write fiction. And so I'm writing. I have a couple scripts right now, and also I'm writing another poetry book, which is looking a little bit prettier than the last one. So I'm also evolving in that way. And it's just like I mentioned, it's part of another process, another stage of this post-deportation, this never-ending post-deportation experience.
And Lala, did you want to share anything about the organization that you work with for folks to check it out or anything?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna type it right here.
Oh, good, thank you.
The organization is called Otros Dreams en Acción. And it's an organization who it's a grassroots organization which was created for and by people who grew up in the States that are now deported. We're committed to mutual support and political action for deportees and returnees here in Mexico and undocumented families. We do a lot of translocal work because even though we're deported or we're returned to Mexico, we're still very much part of our communities back home. You know, and that's something that I think both of the countries need to understand. That's what we call this translocal work, because we're local here and we're local back home in our communities. So you can check it out. We're more active on that on Instagram, but we're on Facebook as well. And yeah, you can find out a little bit more about what we do there.
Thank you.
And also the movie of the film of Lalo is ready, and it's in a festival, the movie festival here in DC. It's a Immigration Film Festival, and we are gonna share that. You already shared about it, but we are gonna share again in our post session email. So you will find email. So you will find information there. And thank you so much. Sorry, Annie, please continue.
Yeah, no, that's it. I was just going to thank you so much, Lalo, for this evening. I want to offer people to tell people what our next webinar will be, because we won't have anything in November, but we'll be back together December 7th. And the registration is open for that session. And that's going to be a one-time session with Reverend Lian Schutt, who is a Buddhist teacher. And she just wrote a book called Home is Here, Practicing Anti-Racism with the Engaged Eightfold Path. So if you're interested in how that goes together, she's born in Vietnam in a Buddhist family, but studied insight and Zen traditions in the US and in Thailand, Japan, and Vietnam. She's a founding member of the Buddhists of Color. She's also I'm not sure if she's the founder or is the one who is doing the access to zen.org. So she's really all about making Zen practice more accessible. And this book should be really interesting. And Adriana and I have volunteered to be in conversation with her. So that will be December 7th. So please go to makingvisible.org and sign up as soon as you can. And I just want to make sure we say that. Oh, and then it's in the chat. But Lalo, really, we can't thank you enough for what you shared and being willing. I know you said you didn't want to be in that film originally, and I'm so glad you were, because your part of the film really brought it all together and really meant a lot to have that in the film, I think. think everybody here got a lot out of it. So thank you. Thank you so much. Any last words, or should we have a final bell, Adriana?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we'll finish with a bell and just sharing that for all of the benefits that we might have gotten this evening, we want to share them out to the world, especially to beings who are still struggling and suffering and dealing with situations where they don't feel at home and they're separated from their families and facing unfair immigration laws and unable to be where they need to be and want to be. So sending that out. Thank you to everyone who's been here with us.
Thank you.